So, when we talk about contemporary land claims, I'm going to do a quick review first about the treaty negotiation process, the process by which we sort of turn claims and ideas and relationships into treaties. And some of this is coming from our earlier discussions of, say, the numbered treaties and other treaties like them, but it absolutely applies as well to sort of the contemporary treaty process. So, one of the first things that it is important to understand is that the treaty process itself is somewhat specific, in that if you look at it, there are no treaties between Alberta and British Columbia, for example. And there are no treaties between Alberta and British Columbia because the understanding is that you can do that with laws because Alberta and British Columbia are part of the same whole. There are treaties between different nations, between, say, Britain and France, between Canada and the United States, all of those things, those are regulated by treaties. So, conceptually, what we use treaties to do is to negotiate relationships between independent sort of nation states is the phrase that the political scientists use. That sort of comes out of European history in the 18th century. But for right now, that's an important part of understanding what's going on here. Is that when we talk about treaties between Canada and Indigenous people, one of the things that you're sort of recognizing implicitly in doing that is that Indigenous people, A, have some form of independent nationhood, right? Because otherwise they're not competent to sign the treaties. And B, that we have to have those sort of nation to nation relationships with Indigenous people. That is not always the position that the federal government has taken practically. So, for example, there is no other set of treaties that would have allowed, for example, one party to say, oh, by the way, you have to educate your children this way, and we're going to take your kids away from you in order to do so, because we're trying to assimilate you. Like, that's not how treaties work, even when we're talking about treaties that end wars. So, one of the things you need to understand about the way that the federal government's relationship with Canada's Indigenous people works is that it exists in this kind of weird tension space where sometimes we talk about nation to nation relationships, and that's what we're looking at when we look at treaties. Um, and that's necessary because without that, the federal government can't get access to Indigenous land. So there's sort of this recognition of nation status when it comes to that. But then there's also this kind of infantilization and this idea that Indigenous people's cultures are immature and therefore they're childish, and this is the justification for why they couldn't vote, for why they couldn't control their own children's education, all of those sorts of pieces. So when we talk about that, recognize that that relationship exists in that sort of odd space. Um, the other thing to understand is to understand what goals people have when they enter into treaty relationships. So, for example, when we talk about the federal government's goal in entering into treaty negotiations, their goal is almost always, when we start talking even about the numbered treaties, let alone the contemporary ones that we're getting into this week, but when they're talking about even the numbered treaties, their goal is to secure legal access to land. Okay, so everything else doesn't matter to them, right? They're not really interested in the well being and preservation of Indigenous cultures. They might talk about that, but that's not their, like, we have to have this or it doesn't work for us moment. We have to have this or it doesn't work for us moment. If you look at the numbered treaties and if you look at sort of later ones as well, is what is referred to as a land surrender clause. And what that basically means is that the federal government needs to have a guarantee and a document in the treaty text that says this is the only claim that we have on this land, and after this, that claim is settled. After this, the federal government of Canada controls this land. That is sort of the necessary piece from the federal government's perspective. But when we talk about what pushes Indigenous groups to negotiate treaty, you wind up with some very different answers. So, for example, Treaty 6, and we talked about this a little bit when we talked about the medicine chest provision. Treaty 6 was negotiated largely after there had been a pandemic or several of them, and a lot of illness running through Indigenous communities. So, one of the things that was really important to them was access to sort of Western and reliable medical care. Um, and those ideas shift, right? Treaty 1 and Treaty 2, a lot of the conversation there was about ensuring that Indigenous people got compensation for the roads, for the use of the roads through their territory that the settlers had been using to go west. And so it's important to understand the motivations for coming to that sort of treaty negotiation space. Um, and those are sort of historical examples when we look at what people's goals were to enter, for example, into the numbered treaties. When we talk about contemporary treaty negotiations, so basically any treaty negotiation since 1970 going forward, sort of, the motivations for Indigenous groups to enter into treaty negotiations are somewhat different. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is and what that sort of looks like. But part of this is about recognition, in that, for example, without treaty, it's really difficult to get the advantages, such as they are, of having Indigenous status in this country. So that's sort of questions about taxation, that's questions about access to certain funding for your community, that's questions about all that kind of thing. But it's also about sort of recognition as, quote, real Indigenous people, because the federal government's position has been that Indigenous people in Canada comprise almost entirely of the people who have treaties. So the federal government, when they deal with Indigenous issues, deals almost exclusively with groups that have treaties. This causes all kinds of challenges. We've talked about this a little bit in class for groups like the Métis, who are Indigenous in a lot of respects, but never had treaties. So, what does their recognition as an Indigenous group in Canada mean in terms of the federal government's responsibilities to them, in terms of their ability to challenge development applications, in terms of their ability to exercise rights to land? All of that is sort of premised on that idea about treaty, um, and in and then sort of again in a contemporary context, and we'll get into this a little bit more, is that in a contemporary context, one of the motivations for Indigenous groups to negotiate treaties, and especially to negotiate particular forms of treaties, is about the pursuit of self-governance and about the pursuit of autonomy. So in the sort of 1970 forward time period, Indigenous groups have recognized that treaty negotiation, especially treaty negotiation in the contemporary context, is one of the spaces they can use to get formalized, structured access to forms of autonomy, to forms of governance, to forms of the ability to control their own communities and their own outcomes. And that kind of autonomy is really, really important to them. So, in a lot of ways, that is what drives many Indigenous groups to move towards and to ask for, because they have to ask for it, treaty settlement in the present day.